Welcome everyone to the App State Mid-Year Energy Summit Plenary, and thank you for joining us. My name is Lee Ball, and I'm the Chief Sustainability Officer at Appalachian State University, and we're excited for another Mid-Year Energy Summit. I want to thank all of the attendees that are here today, all of the people that have been coming to the Energy Summit for the past 9 years, all the new attendees. To you, welcome to the Energy Summit family. So the Appalachian Energy Summit started 9 years ago as an effort to bring together energy professionals, faculty, students from all across the UNC system, in addition to other private and public schools in the Southeast, and now that we're online, around the world. And we also focus on supporting local government and the NGO sector, and we have many industry friends and partners as well. So the Energy Summit has traditionally had multiple working groups, and today we'll have the same working groups this afternoon. So many of you are registered for those working groups. We really appreciate your investment of your time and efforts and sharing your experiences and expertise this afternoon with your peers. In addition to that, we have a student summit. We typically have our student summit in during the Energy Summit in the summer. And this time we've included it as part of the mid-year summit. And you can see that we have a career in energy discussion panel, a zero waste discussion group, and a climate action discussion group. I want to thank all the students, the many students who have signed up today to be a part of this. And welcome. We look forward to your contributions in these discussion groups this afternoon. In addition, we have started something new, a webinar series. The Energy Summit has continued our fall webinar series into the spring. So if you haven't registered, please consider registering for these 3 webinar series. The next one is next week on February 18th, where we'll be discussing university shutdown and COVID-19 emergency management. And then on March 4th, we'll be discussing microgrids, battery storage. And on Thursday, the 18th of March, we'll be talking with Jay Lanier from Interface Incorporated about embodied carbon in the built environment. So today, before we introduce our plenary speaker, we have the distinct pleasure to welcome an old friend of ours, Professor Bob Powell, who's an associate professor in the Civil Architecture and Environmental Department of the College of Engineering at North Carolina A&T, NC A&T State University. He's a registered architect and teaches architectural related courses in the program. Professor Powell has designed and built buildings that incorporate energy efficient and renewable energy technologies in several areas, including market rate and affordable housing, as well as commercial and institutional buildings. He's been an advocate of sustainable development, having served as the chair of the North Carolina Sustainable Energy Association, on the board of Advanced Energy Corporation, and as a member of the recently formed Carolina HBCU Leadership Pathway Council. He is here today to share some preliminary information about this organization. So Bob, welcome back, old friend, and take it away.
Thank you, Lee. And it truly is, I'm just overjoyed at being back with my tribe. As Lee said, just a quick moment today to talk about this new opportunity that's coming, and it's just started, and so it's really in the front end, preliminary stages. Frankly, I've just been appointed to this group in the last several weeks, but I wanted to get the word out. Particularly to the HBCUs across North Carolina related to this project. So the Carolina's HBCU Energy Leadership Council is a group that is composed of representatives from energy industries across North and South Carolina, from a broad range of energy companies, and then also with representation from the public and private HBCUs in North and South Carolina. And our purpose is to create essentially a pipeline. There's a series of activities that will be coming on board to provide mentorships, workshops. There's a thing they call the energy boot camp, a wide variety of activities, and they're just being planned now. They're not really established. But as these activities come on board, what my hope is right now is to connect with all the HBCUs in North Carolina, public and private, and determine what interests people have, frankly, what assets people have. I know people are probably doing a lot of things in this arena already, and very specifically to learn from you your ideas about what's the best way to do this. So my email is rpowell@ncat, and I'll put that in the chat, I guess, Lee, at ncat.edu. And please, anybody who's got ideas, questions, comments, whatever you have to offer, we are definitely looking to share with everybody else. And so, Lee, thank you for the opportunity to share this with everybody, and look forward to connecting with everybody. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Bob. This is great. Energy Summit certainly has your back. It's right in sync with the spirit of what we try to do, to share information with each other and support each other. So look forward to helping out with this very important project. So thanks again for sharing, Bob.
Thank you.
So today, for the plenary portion of the mid-year meeting, we have presenting Dave Karlsgodt, who is the director for Brailsford Dunlavey Incorporated Energy and Utilities Practice Group and leads the firm's sustainability efforts with higher education clients. With over 10 years of experience delivering sustainability solutions, his expertise includes district energy systems, greenhouse gas mitigation, energy and finance modeling, and data aggregation and visualization. Currently, he's leading energy transition and carbon mitigation efforts with the University of California System and UMass Amherst. Dave also hosts the Campus Energy and Sustainability podcasts, whom I've been proud to be a guest on. Thank you, Dave, where he talks with leading campus professionals, thought leaders, engineers, and innovators addressing the unique challenges and opportunities facing higher ed and corporate campuses. Dave has an extensive amount of experience in this field. I know a lot of people are, interested in trying to solve the big wicked problems related to, to decarbonizing these, large campus systems. And we knew that Dave was a perfect person to bring on the program to talk about this. Before we get started, just a couple of announcements. I want to let everyone know all attendees are muted. We will have a question and answer session at the end of the presentation. So please, if you have a question for us or for Dave specifically, you can type your question in the Q&A function that's at the bottom of the screen, kind of on the to the right of the chat. We will be monitoring the chat as well, but we prefer to use a Q&A. We will save the questions to the end. And then also wanted to let everyone know that these webinars are being recorded. So we'll have the opportunity to, you'll be able to watch them again or share them. And so with that, David, welcome to the App State Mid-Year Energy Summit.
I'm really glad to be here, Lee. I'm gonna make sure I get my screen share set up here before we get started, but be able to see, okay?
Yep.
All right, great. Well, yeah, thank you very much, Lee. It's a real honor and to be able to talk to you all here today. I'm going to go through a presentation. I'm going to call it in 3 acts. I'll give you a little bit of background of how I got into this world of climate action planning first, and some of the insights that I've gained along the way. In Act 2, we'll go through some trends in tech, kind of a rapid fire visual journey through what we're seeing out there in higher education. And then the last one we'll call Mind the Funding Gap. So we'll talk a little bit about the money, which enabling this transition. I'm going to start with a bit of a caveat, which is to say, I'm going to talk about some stories from some different institutions and show some examples from some different institutions. I want to be clear that I'm not a representative of those institutions directly, except for my own employer. But I'm hoping I can share some things to you to kind of give you a backstage view about how things actually happened. So Lee, we can talk a little bit more about that later, but I'm going to start with my first section here, which I'm going to call a nonlinear case study, which is very much in line with that, which the basic idea here is we tend to tell the success stories about how great things were when they all turned out, but we forget to tell the story about what actually happened. So I'll tell you my story as honestly as I can, but here we go. So first, a quick background on who I am. I grew up in rural Western Montana. I finished high school in Missoula, Montana, home of the University of Montana. I studied music at the University of North Texas, where I majored in jazz arranging. I worked as a musician for a few years in the Dallas area, including a few cruise ship gigs out of Miami and Puerto Rico. And in about 1999, I moved from music to software. And then in 2000, I moved to Seattle, and that's where I live with my lovely family, which you can see in the bottom right corner here. In about 2002, I started my own software development firm where I worked with everything from small mom and pop companies to large organizations like the King County Housing Authority and our first hometown tech giant, Microsoft. And for those of you youngsters, 2002 is, we'll say pre-TikTok. Mark Zuckerberg was still in college. iPhones were still 5 years away. And I'm pretty sure we still used phone books back then. But about 2011, I was introduced to Rob McKenna, an MBA who worked for an energy strategy company based out of Utah, and Mike Walters, who is an MEP engineer who worked for a national engineering firm out of the Midwest. And Rob and Mike were in the process of starting a joint venture spinout firm, and their core services were intended to be integrated energy planning, and the core market was higher education district energy systems. So the big idea for them was to build a decision support system to help campuses navigate complexities of energy supply and demand, find cost-effective, responsive to aggressive renewable energy and carbon mitigation goals, and to optimize the use of campus resources. So the way that Rob basically summed it up for me was, you're saving money, saving the world, and sign me up. That sounded pretty exciting. So I switched careers, and I was brought in to see what role software could play to help speed up some of the early successes they were having. So part of what had prompted the idea for the software was work that Mike and Rob had been doing with Michigan State University. And they were working with a woman by the name of Kathy Lindahl. Kathy actually had started her career in athletics, and she was not particularly technical, but she was a strong leader and a senior administrator who reported to the vice president for finance and operations at Michigan State, basically the CFO. So Kathy's group had been inundated by a stream of capital requests as they were getting requests to try to keep their energy system running. And her boss was getting a little bit tired of these big surprises, asking for large chunks of capital that they didn't know about. So Mike and Rob had been developing some tools to help process, and a process to help Michigan State work through these challenges. They built this Excel-based model, and I was added to help turn that, Excel spreadsheet model into something that was more web-based that the team could use themselves. So the idea was, how could we synthesize more information, run more scenarios, help people visualize how all these pieces fit together? And a phrase we used a lot back then was modeling at the pace of conversation. So this next section here, and this is definitely the closest thing I hope I get to a sales pitch today, but I'm going to break it down here in a second, so bear with me. So over this 5-year period that we worked with Michigan State, there was 2 clear goals that they had from an energy transition perspective. They were trying to decrease their greenhouse gas emissions and increase the use of renewable energy. But they also talked about how they couldn't give up on managing their life cycle spending, managing reliability, and responding to the growth. And they had a lot of new buildings coming online, and they'd even received federal funding for a new particle accelerator, which basically when it was turned on, it would use as much electricity as multiple small campuses. So we worked with them to develop what we call a business as usual scenario for their campus. So in short, a picture of where they were heading with their current systems, their policies, and their practices. And we helped make the case for some short-term opportunities or quick wins, and all while making sure that those short wins didn't preclude them from taking advantage of various long-term opportunities that were starting to take shape. So as the parts and pieces came together in a plan that included financial, environmental, and reliability implications of their strategy, it also included a delivery roadmap, basically how do they deliver these things. So we ended up with really a great plan. So I'm showing again this in kind of a nice one-page graphic, but really this was 5 years of history. So every year we'd come back and we'd revisit their criteria. So how had that changed? We'd look at how the technologies had changed, and they changed a lot over this 5-year period. And then we'd also look at things like how federal policies were changing and tax incentives were changing. So this really was 4 or 5 major iterations of planning. And they had a lot of great outcomes. So we were able to identify plan efficiency opportunities that saved them over $1 million a year. We were able to help them make the switch from coal to natural gas. They were, during this time, able to invest about $40 million into their buildings, and they were able to save about $10 million a year, but also addressed a lot of deferred maintenance. And finally, they were able to deploy a suite of renewable energy technologies, including an anaerobic digester, which had some research connections, and a 10 megawatt solar carport, which at the time it was installed was one of the largest of its kind. And they delivered these solutions in a variety of ways. Most of them they did themselves because they were comfortable doing that. And then a few of them they partnered with other firms to, like the building energy conservation measures. And then the solar carport, they actually worked with a third party to do a corporate PPA so they could take advantage of the investment tax credits. So I just gave you essentially like the pitch or the story that we would give as a consultant, trying to say, okay, work with us, we're great. This is the success you're going to get. But I actually want to break this down a little bit and give you a little bit more of kind of really what happened behind the scenes, and hopefully share with you more of the process that you're likely to experience as a campus, whether you work with somebody like us or not. So first of all, I do want to say I'm proud of the work we did, absolutely, and our contributions, but I do want to be clear that while I was brought in and we built this great software system, it really wasn't the software that was the secret to success. So let's figure out what was. So I'm gonna start with Kathy. So we had a champion, and behind her we had a great team to work with. So we were able to work with a seasoned energy manager who knew all 600 of their buildings like the back of his hand. We had an energetic sustainability manager who was always pushing for action. We had a seasoned engineer who was skeptical, but in all the right ways, but she was at least asking the right questions and kind of pointing us in the right direction. And most importantly, I think, we had a direct line to a thoughtful CFO who was willing to make decisions based on things other than first cost, partly because he had such a great team behind him. So Kathy was able to serve as his proxy and could pretty much get a meeting with anybody we needed any time. And I didn't really fully appreciate how rare that was until later. So just to summarize, we had a great champion, a great supporting team, direct line to the CFO. All right, so we got to start to maybe what was going on here. So what else? Well, around the time I got involved, Michigan State had just released what they called an energy transition plan. And I think Rob and Mike had some supporting role in developing this, but this was really championed by their sustainability director, Jennifer Battle. This plan established some very clear short-term and long-term goals, and it had enough detail to outline the technical feasibility of what they were trying to do, but it wasn't prescriptive, saying exactly what they were going to do. But the key piece here was they had these really clear short and long-term goals. So these may not seem super ambitious for today, but remember this was 2012. This was when coal was still king, oil was $100 a barrel, wind and solar really hadn't dropped in price yet. They were still considered expensive and unreliable. I think by now we had an iPhone, but I think Tesla was only selling about a few thousand cars a year. So this was kind of a different era. And looking back, it was really that short-term goal that really drove the decisions. 3 years was long enough for them to make some changes, but it was still relevant to the decision making of the people in the day-to-day meetings. So we can add that maybe to our list here. So I want to talk about the software. So we did get to do some really cool stuff. We built tools to combine energy efficiency and deferred maintenance. We built tools that allowed staff and students and other service providers to create their own solutions, and they could drag and drop them onto a timeline. We created optimization algorithms to find the best portfolio for a bunch of different constraints. And some of our scenarios got so complex that we basically had a team of software developers working all day, every day, just to keep the system running. We had to build detailed logs so we could see what was happening and debug the system. We had installation instructions. We ended up having to talk to attorneys about data security and intellectual property rights and things like this. And my 14-year-old, I think, summed this graph that I'm showing here up. She was only 7 or 8 at the time, but she would call this graph the Rainbow Mountains. So it's a beautiful graph. We could show electrical production by asset by month 40 years into the future. And we got a little carried away. So, I mean, the whole team was into it. We were all learning together, but I hope it's pretty obvious that this got a little bit too complicated. So I can't remember who it was, but somebody suggested that we bring in one of MSU's rockstar faculty to kind of help us out when things got a little out of hand. And I remember getting handed a printed copy of this paper. I think that's actually a picture of my printed copy of the paper and told that Professor Deb was going to join us for lunch one day and talk about model optimization. So in one sense, I was excited to be able to talk to this well-respected modeling expert, but I wasn't really sure what we were going to expect, because how was this going to apply to what we were doing? So Dr. Jeb, he joined us for lunch, and he was extremely nice and curious about what we were doing. And we tried to explain like the inputs and outputs of our model and kind of where we were trying to go with what we were doing. And he answered our questions, and he answered our questions about his research. And here's a picture of the multi-genetic algorithm trying to find a Pareto front. And you should be impressed only that I found an open source graphic to share. Not that I have any idea what that actually means. But as he kind of dug in and asked us more questions, he started getting kind of puzzled about how he was going to be able to help us, until all of a sudden he had a bit of an aha moment, and he said, what you have is a wicked problem. And I know Lee mentioned the term wicked problem in his introduction. I hope most of you are familiar with this concept now, but if you're not, it's not wicked as in evil, but it's wicked as in the opposite of a tame problem. So we're familiar with tame problems like the moonshot or even the COVID vaccine. We have one now, but we still have a pandemic, unfortunately. Wicked problems are kind of more insidious. So compared to a tame problem, the big wicked problems we're dealing with right now include the global pandemic, structural racism, climate change. These are all extremely complex, interrelated wicked problems. Our human instinct is to react with these with the silver bullet solutions. For higher ed, this seems to be the study, and in the world of consulting, that's definitely the silver bullet oftentimes. And for climate change or climate planning, you might hear, oh, well, it's just energy efficiency, or we need a price on carbon, or nuclear power, or biofuels, or net zero buildings. So many of these are solutions that have a role to play, but unfortunately, none of them by themselves is sufficient to deal with the problem that we're facing. Another insidious part of wicked problems is the unintended consequences. These are some classic ones I'm showing on screen, but the most common one I'm seeing right now in my work is the shift to cogeneration back in the 90s and early 2000s. And I'll come back to that one in my next section here. But just to kind of summarize this idea, I found this quote, which I really appreciate, which is, some problems are so complex that you just have to be highly intelligent and well-informed just to be undecided about them. And so while I'll say bringing in Professor Deb to help us out, was great. And he definitely set us on a new path and gave us some new language to how to think about our problems. This isn't, always how it goes. I would say getting guidance from academia in the process is great, But I would also say, having been through a lot of these exercises, there's lots of times that we look to academia to tell us the answer. And I don't think that's actually the role. And I think thinking back on this situation, really what he did was help us frame the question. So as you're going through climate action planning exercises, staff really are the ones that need to be driving the solution set. Use the academic part of your campus to help you think through the problem in different ways than you might otherwise. The other topic that maybe, Lee, we can get into during the question and answer were the students. So we were able to share the modeling framework with students and allow them to try out some different scenarios, which was a lot of fun. But again, similar to the academic part of the campus, I think this is more about teaching students and more about inviting them in and letting them push than it really is about having them help you find the answer. So a bit ago, I'd mentioned how we got carried away with the software, and we did eventually figure that part out. As we built out our modeling framework 2.0, we came back to this diagram again and again. So strategic planning is a very early step on the road to transformation. So planning is when you have the most options and the least amount of information. So that's why detailed studies often end up gathering dust with volumes of wrong detail, the volumes of detail on the wrong solution. So one of the things I think we really came back to was making our tools and our planning processes higher level and not getting it down into the weeds on any one solution, especially at this early framing stage. Another key concept that we borrowed from my world from software is the concept of agile development methodology. So this is core Silicon Valley thinking. So building quickly, failing fast, learn, repeat. In the world of climate action planning, this is a cycle I described with Michigan State. When you start, you won't have all the information you need. In fact, you'll never have all the information you need. But with each planning iteration, you can learn, you can adjust, you can pressure test these ideas. And while you certainly don't want your central energy system to fail, we're still in the world of strategic planning, not the technical planning that you need to do to keep your systems reliable. So nobody's going to die if the CFO doesn't like your plan, but your plans are going to die themselves if you don't de-risk the ideas before you present them. You have to de-risk your ideas to get to a decision. So fail fast and fail often. So let's add that to the list. So, and as I kind of pulled this list together, I did this sort of organically, and I want to say this is a list. This is probably not the list. And I suppose different campuses are going to have a different recipe for their success, but it's probably going to include most of these elements. And I think I want to come back to, our early hypothesis was we could build a system or a software system that could help us think through these problems. And we certainly did, but it really wasn't so much about the data visualization, the methodologies. It really was a lot more of it was about the people and the relationships. And so I hope there's some lessons from the School of Hard Knocks in there for you as you go through your own processes on your campus. All right, so taking a breath here, I'm going to switch gears, and the next section is going to be a little bit more trends and tech, or I guess I should say tech and trends, because I think I'm going to do it in that order. So our characters in this section are going to be infographics, and I want to highlight that these are graphics. Most of these graphics are available on the Second Nature Solutions Center, and you can use them yourselves. They're open source. So I've lost count of how many different campuses I've worked on. I think it's probably it's certainly in the dozens, but I'm hoping that these are at least the building blocks that you can use. So let's start at the top. So whenever we put together a climate action plan, there's the classic carbon mitigation hierarchy. So avoid doing things that create pollution first, then reduce the amount of pollution from the things that you are doing, then replace things that create pollution with things that don't create pollution. And then if you still have pollution at the end, maybe help somebody else avoid, reduce, or replace their emissions. So there's one more category I don't have on this graphic, which is negative pollution or sucking pollution out of the air. And maybe we can talk about that later, but I'm going to leave that off my list for now. But starting at the top. So when you do build, how do you make your buildings better? So there's a whole suite of different strategies here that I'm going to summarize as high performance buildings here. But this includes things like LEED certifications, the Living Building Challenge. Out here in the Northwest, we're seeing a lot of large wood buildings, alternatives to steel and concrete, things like that. And there are entire conferences and organizations that talk about these topics, but I'll just say this should be in your plan in some way, shape, or form. But one thing I will note, people get excited about this topic, but they sometimes get hyper-focused on the new shiny buildings and forget about the massive campus they still have. So this chart shows a typical space forecast for one of our campuses. So it shows new, renovated, and existing and demolished square footage kind of forecasted into the future. And you'll notice, this is a campus with some pretty aggressive growth plans, but there's still a lot of existing space well into the future. So if you're going to pursue this strategy, you got to remember you're really only affecting the green and the blue section at the top of your graph, and you still have a lot more work to do. All right, so next, I'm going to put this in the broad category of behavior change or energy conservation. So think Jimmy Carter sweaters here. But for campuses, there's actually a bunch of things that fall into this category. So another thing that I'm not showing here would be things like dorm competitions or finding ways to have people to avoid using energy, avoid emissions. But the one I'll focus on here is green labs. This is one we found to be very cost effective and impactful. There's an organization called My Green Lab that's great, that's pioneered this topic area. And they touch on a bunch of aspects of sustainability beyond just the energy and carbon pieces. But one of the two key things in here would be things like closing fume hoods, which can save you a lot of energy through your HVAC system. And then the other one would be things like ultra low temperature freezers. Ultra low temperature freezers are being used a lot right now with our COVID vaccine, but they use as much energy as a house individually in some cases. So there's a good behavior change solution for you. There's a similar concept called smart labs, which really gets us into our next topic, which is more about energy efficiency. So here's a couple of examples from that category. So you're typically making some type of investment in equipment and controls and software, or people fixing things so you can get more utility from your utilities. So campuses usually do at least some of this in-house, but there are plenty of third parties that will come in and help you with accelerating the efficiency programs. And certainly your utility company is a great place to start. They usually will have incentive dollars that can help you invest in your energy efficiency projects. So I'll come back to that one a little bit more in Act 3. And the next group I'm going to talk about is renewable energy. And solar and wind are the obvious ones here. I've got electrical energy storage, which is really more of an enabling technology. And then we've got pipeline quality biogas, which you could also argue maybe biomass goes in here. Some of, all of these have their challenges in terms of siting or life cycle costs or life cycle assessments on their actual impact. But if you go, especially if you start going down some of the biogas, biomass vein, you'll quickly learn there's a difference between carbon-free and renewable. But these are all things you should be considering in your renewable energy strategy. The next I'm going to call out as renewable thermal energy. And I might call this non-combustion thermal energy. And I've spent a lot of time on this set of topics over the last few years. And consider this an Act 3 preview, because I'll dig more into this in a second. But for now, these are ways of heating and cooling without burning stuff. And again, I think there's this concept of thermal energy storage, which I guess we're showing chilled water storage in this graphic, but there's a bunch of different ways to do that. But again, that's an enabling technology here. Another rabbit hole here is offsets. So I'm throwing this one in my offset category, and you'll probably need some of these if you want to make a public carbon neutrality claim, but not all offsets are created equal. And I do want to make a point that offsets are not the same as renewable energy credits, which is really has more to do with well, I'll talk about that here in a second. So there are a bunch of other solutions that you'll hear about, and sometimes people will conflate these with some of the technologies, but they're really more business models or financial tools. So a few I'll highlight here. Renewable energy credits, which is really about trading the renewable attributes of renewable power. There's ESCOs or energy service companies, so that's a way of funding your energy efficiency efforts. There's the public-private partnership models, and there's many varieties of these, but how can you bring in a third party to either maybe help own some of the assets and sell you services, or there's a variety of different structures there. And then there's this idea of commissioning, continuous commissioning or retro commissioning, where you're using software and business processes to try to keep your buildings tuned up. So, you could argue some of these are in some of those upper categories, but these are things we're seeing. And then another big one that we're talking about a lot in our climate action planning are just the policies in general, but specifically carbon pricing. So, what is the potential for some actual carbon price, so say a federal or state legislation that's going to charge you a fee on carbon? But there are also some concepts around shadow pricing or concepts like the social cost of carbon that you're going to want to include in your plan to help you make life cycle cost decisions. There's a bunch of other topics that I'm going to kind of gloss over here. Land management, which may be more applicable to your campus if you're in a rural area or you have a lot of land holdings or have a bunch of forests that you own. Irrigation, the water energy nexus. Sustainable procurement is actually quite a large one, especially for other sustainable outcomes that you're trying to achieve. It's typically not a huge direct carbon emission reduction, but if you start getting into your supply chain emissions, this is kind of your primary tool set. Improved commuting, if you're tracking your commuting or air travel related. Then there's a bunch of solutions I'm going to point out here that are, I wouldn't say don't waste your time with, but be ready to sort of dismiss quickly, unless you've got some reason that you're going to do some research associated with it or something like that. But these are probably not appropriate for a campus, even if they might have some legs in the future for the economy at large. But modular nuclear is the one that we hear about that always seems to be 10 years away. The idea of downscaling a nuclear power plant to the size of a campus. There's combined heat and power, which was an amazing solution and actually was something that most campuses were pursuing even 5 or 10 years ago, but has now kind of flipped because you're committing yourself to natural gas for the next 30 years. Waste to energy is something that's been popular in Europe. And then the last one, maybe I'll give, this one I think has a little more potential, but if you're putting a plan together right now and trying to make decisions for the next 10 years, this is something you don't need to spend a lot of time on. You're going to need to wait for it to develop. But the hydrogen economy, there are some campuses experimenting with this a little bit, but it's got a little ways to go. So let's look at how we fit some of these plans together. So here's a West Coast example, pretty developed plan with lots of individual solutions, but I'll highlight kind of just in broad strokes their strategy. They've got some pretty massive growth. So you can see that purple band at the top, which helps get rid of some of that the emissions they would otherwise have from new buildings. They have some continued energy efficiency programs. They've got a whole bunch of thermal energy projects. These are large kind of transformational projects on their campus, matched with renewable energy. So as they get rid of their need for gas, they're replacing it with renewable energy purchases. And then they are considering some use of biomethane in the future. And then at the very bottom, you'll see that they have some really hard to abate emissions that they're going to get rid of with some offsets. Different example from the Midwest. This is a campus that actually has made some pretty major investments in getting off of steam already. So they're kind of more of an electrified campus already. So they're doing strategic energy management, which is really a suite of energy efficiency solutions and some building standards, some behavior change. You'll see this one's a pretty small band of behavior change. A little bit of on-site solar, although it's relatively small. They were looking at scope 3, so they have some fleet efficiency and some offsets for travel. A large PPA, which that giant green section in the middle, so using renewable grid power, and then some offsets at the end for the parts that they haven't quite figured out yet. I do want to note that these plans change. So here's a different example of that through a couple of different planning iterations. So you can see how the plan started to take shape in that first iteration, but by the third iteration, the projects were much more defined and they had a lot more clarity about what the future was likely to look like. And then another example of one I've been working on recently of a school in the Northeast. You'll see here the two large sections, the red sections, are this idea of getting off of steam and using heat trading, which I'll dig into in a second, and then ground source heat exchange, which is another form of renewable energy, using the heat in the ground as opposed to using things like air source heat pumps and other things like that. But again, you'll see none of these plans, there's no silver bullet. There's usually some combination of solutions. There's a bunch of different things you're trying to fit together. So let's talk trends. So what do we see kind of just big picture as we, I just walked you through a bunch of individual solutions, but as you put them all together, what do we see? So first thing, system efficiency. So just a big trend that we're seeing is this idea of going from steam-based systems that are powered by combustion or burning stuff and moving towards lower temperature systems. So that could either be a low temperature hot water system or even an ambient temperature water system where you use, you're moving water or at a certain, whatever temperature around the campus and then trading heat between buildings. So buildings that need heat, take it out of the system. Buildings that are rejecting heat, put it into the system, and it helps cancel out some of the needs. The next thing I'll talk about are just those technologies. So I guess we used to do this individually, but we're getting into these network buildings. And the biggest idea here is you can use controls to optimize where the energy is needed rather than everything being its own isolated energy demand. And so the advantage here is your operating costs go way down. They're simpler systems to run, but they're expensive to put in the first place, or capital intensive. And there's specialty knowledge here, and that's not to say that they're hard to run, but it's just to say that they're different than what we're used to. So people are used to running steam systems. They're getting familiar with these systems. And in Europe, that's not the case. People are very familiar with running these lower temperature systems, but here in the United States, this is still kind of an emerging trend. The next major trend I'll point out is just general decarbonization of the economy in the United States. So we have a long way to go in the United States to decarbonize our entire country, but the one sector that really has made massive progress over the last 10 years is the electricity sector. And transportation's expected to follow quickly behind. The announcement by GM, I think it was last week, about no longer selling fossil fuel based cars within the next 10 to 15 years, indication of that. So campuses really kind of fall into this industrial line here. So they haven't really, that sector really hasn't moved very much recently. But part of what we're seeing is campuses trying to ride that electric wave down by moving away from combustion, moving towards electricity, using renewable grid electricity as the primary source. And that's sort of the last trend that we see, is this move to electricity from a renewable source and this idea of recycling or transferring energy rather than making it twice. So I want to dig into more of a specific example on how this looks if you're at a college campus. So here's an example from a college in the Northeast. Their current system is based on steam. They have a cogeneration system, so their current supply is mostly fossil fuels, a little bit of grid electricity, and a little bit of on-site solar. And actually, I should say quite a bit of on-site solar. It's not like it's just not very much of their overall supply. They use that energy to produce steam, chilled water, and electricity. And in that process, some of that energy is lost. So they have a very, very efficient, award-winning system. But even in that award-winning system, there's a 25% loss at that first step as they make their steam, primarily from the making of steam. As they distribute that energy out to the campus buildings, there's a lot of energy that's actually lost in the steam pipes. So You'll notice here they're using some of the electricity to make the chilled water, so there's kind of a transfer of how the energy goes. But again, you're dropping energy in this next step. And then finally, you get to the end buildings, and especially if you're in a steam-based system, you're supplying steam to the building, and that you don't really want those temperatures in your building. You want more 70 degrees range temperatures. So there's another loss in that step. So as you add up all the losses going from your supply to your demand, only about half the energy actually makes it to the building in a useful form. So this is one of the biggest challenges that we see with most current systems. They were built this way because this was, doing the district energy system was better than individually the buildings doing this. It was cost effective, but there is actually quite a bit of energy loss in the system. So the future system that we're looking at for this campus, so I'll show you the dotted line still shows the supply, the total of their previous supply, but in the future, we expect they're still going to need a tiny bit of combustion. So that could be fossil fuels, that could come from a renewable fuel source, but they can use renewable grid electricity as their primary input. And this actually expects they'll double their on-site solar capacity, which will look like a massive amount on site. Like if you go to this campus after that's done, there'll be solar panels everywhere, but it's still a relatively small piece of their overall supply. But instead of making steam, we're going to be making low temperature hot water, or you could make a system like this that uses ambient temperature water, but in this design, it was low temperature hot water. And you'll notice that, these don't add up, but that's because we're using this concept of heat exchange. So there's a massive opportunity to trade heat between buildings, either at different times of the day, or if you're using ground source heating, you're basically trading heat with the earth and then trading it throughout the year. So in the summertime, you're putting heat into the ground, and in the wintertime, you're essentially extracting that heat back out of the ground to keep the system in balance throughout the year. There's still going to be energy loss in some of the distribution, but it's going to be much, much smaller. Same with the distribution. You're going to lose energy in the distribution as you get the energy out to the buildings, or as the buildings trade the heat. But again, because the temperature is lower, you're not losing as much along the way. And then finally, as you get into the buildings, your temperatures you're supplying to the building are way closer to what you actually need. So in this case, we're able to see 200% of the energy that you're putting in, which is really just that combustion, renewable grid electricity, and solar, can give you about 200% that's used productively because of this idea of heat trading. So this is the transformational future we want to see for campuses. So last section here, and then we'll get into some questions. So I hope you're still with me, is the funding gap. So that's a great future, Dave, but that's got to cost me some money to make that happen. And you would be right to think that. Let's look at some examples. So here's another example of this is a pretty simple climate action plan, but it's actually the result of a very detailed engineering study proposing a system similar to the one I just showed you. So we look at this from a carbon perspective. Their future emissions are going to drop by 80%. Their reliance on fossil fuel goes down by about as much. Their energy use intensity for their campus goes way down, and their operation costs would drop about 30%. So that's all great. We like that. Those are great outcomes that we can write a great linear story about how wonderful this project was if it all goes forward. But you get to the end of a planning process like this, and you show the price tag to a CFO, and they will choke on the capital required to make this happen. So in this particular case, I think roughly speaking, it's about 8 times their annual energy spending on gas and electricity. But I will say this has a payback. So you have a project that has a payback that can transform your campus, pays for itself. Like sign me up, right? Why is it so hard? So let's dig into that question. I have to say, I've basically spent the last 10 years of my life trying to figure out higher ed and why it's so hard to make these investments. There's all this great opportunity out there. We see these plans that have the opportunity to save money, to reduce energy, to attack deferred maintenance, to reduce pollution, and improve the comfort and like the utility of the buildings themselves. So what is blocking higher ed? I think there are a bunch of reasons, some of them we touched on earlier, but the biggest one that we see is that higher ed is really not set up to invest in energy. This is when a higher education institution makes a financial decision, they're usually looking at a combination of first cost and strategic impact. Ideally, if you have an enlightened CFO, they will be looking beyond first cost, and that's helpful. But still, the measure is strategic impact. Would you rather invest in something like fixing your steam pipes, or would you rather invest in a new research program or some pet initiative of the president? So those initiatives are going to win every time. There's no question. But when we look kind of from an outside perspective, like how would the market look at this? So here it's a totally different picture. So the market looks at higher ed and says, here's a low risk entity that's got a highly bankable project that's got a great rate of return and a low risk profile. So this is what they see. So how do we get higher ed to either see itself as an investment opportunity or to use the market to get access to that capital? And I can tell you there are billions of dollars kind of waiting in the ready to invest in higher education campuses. So one of the ways we've been kind of thinking about this is helping to move campuses from more of this ad hoc kind of invest as you go, only looking at what we often call low-hanging fruit kind of initiatives, and then seeing that savings dissipate through time. Or can we move campuses more to like an internal investment strategy where you invest in yourself and you can look at yourself as a bank would and make an investment over the long haul? There are opportunities to use the market, and one of the reasons you might want to do that would be, can I do this faster? Can I get more expertise? Can I get those savings quicker? Can I make the transformation faster and then unlock that savings at a larger scale? And then I will note here, there's been a lot of talk about things like these large concession agreements where you see campuses that they'll do that big transformational change, but then they also add a bunch of a different debt vehicle on top of it. I'm not going to really get into the details of that today, but we've been calling that market plus, which is you're kind of going beyond just energy efficiency concepts or the district energy concept there. You're actually getting more into financial engineering at a bigger scale. But I'll point out that most campuses are on the far left here. Most of you are doing some version of ad hoc, maybe some early version of internal and intentional. We've seen a handful of campuses that have done this market-based thing at scale, and very few that have done this kind of large concession idea. So my colleague Rob asked me, okay, well, what do you want people to know after you show them all this information? So I'm going to kind of wrap up here with I'll call it my Ernest Hemingway one-line kind of summary here. But I want to leave you with this. The energy transition is here, and the time to act is now. It's technically possible. That last 10% is going to be hard, but you've got 90% to solve first. And it's going to cost, or it's going to require capital, probably a lot of capital, but it's a good investment. So really your role in climate action planning is to get the CFO on your team. Or if you don't have them on your team already, iterate until the CFO is on your team. And I think with that, we're into chat.
Dave, that was awesome. That was exactly what we were looking for. I really appreciate it. There's a lot there. You certainly inspired a lot of ideas in my mind, and I have my own questions. We'll get to the other questions first. I will say, the Energy Summit started as this initiative to bring people together to share these solutions and ideas. And 9 years ago, we were focused on avoided costs. And, we had a goal of saving the UNC system $1 billion and at least helping to save the UNC system $1 billion in avoided costs, energy costs by 2020. We hit that target, and we have an additional $1 billion by 2025. But, now we're also being asked to decarbonize. And so I think this is the perfect conversation where the two are really combining, and there's opportunity to do good and well at the same time. and just really appreciate your perspective. I knew you'd have a lot to share. So with that said, we had a question from someone that has 2 cogen plants on their campus. They want to know what the downside was. You know, that came in right before your slide that sort of laid out a lot of the downsides. But in addition to those, you know, approximately 50% losses that you explained, can you expand on that a little bit? You know, the potential difficulties in repurposing existing cogen plants, et cetera?
Yeah, and I think I'll maybe, I want to make sure I'm not, it's really not the cogen that's the problem. It's really the steam that's the problem. So with a lot of the campuses, all of the major public universities that we work with a few exceptions, have some form of cogen on their campuses. So this is not, it's not like you're just going to shut it down tomorrow. I mean, these are massive, central to the system. I mean, this is central to reliability. And so I think maybe when you're thinking about cogeneration systems, you need to just, my main advice at this point was don't build a new one today, or at least if you're going to be really thoughtful about the design of what you're going to do today, because you may need some backup power, you may need the fast ramping that they can provide. So there's a lot of good things there, but it's more about the distribution to the buildings is really where the massive losses are. So if you could build, if you have a cogen, and with some of the campuses we're working with now, how can you kind of gracefully retire it over time without losing that efficiency? Because if you, in a lot of places, if you shut your cogen down right now, you'd actually increase your emissions, because if the grid is worse than your cogen, then you're not really doing any good for yourself, and you're losing that reliability. So that's not really what I'm saying. But when you're thinking 10 to 15 to 20, 30 years into the future, the world will be a lot different. And I gave some of those silly examples about, the iPhone and Mark Zuckerberg and Tesla in this talk, kind of on purpose, to think about, when I think back to even 2012, it doesn't seem like that long ago, but we're in a completely different world than we were then. So you can't think about what worked 10 years ago is not going to work 10 years from now. So it's more of that. But we are seeing some campuses. In fact, I think, we haven't been working at Michigan State for a while, but I know they're kind of getting away from the big coal boilers and going to more reciprocating engines, which are more like, it can respond really quickly. So they're kind of like helping with peak demand, but they can turn them off and they're not expected to run all the time. So that's more of that last 10% that I'm kind of referring to. So I hope that kind of helps.
Yeah, I think we'll stick with the STEAM theme here. The questions that are coming in from a lot of our great friends. Thanks for sending the pictures in. I mean, the questions, students, if you have any, don't be shy. Send, put your questions in the Q&A. So can you expand on transitioning from STEAM to grid-tied renewables? If your grid's not renewable, are you accounting for site versus source emissions?
Yeah. So I think to justify the transition, you definitely want to know what your emissions are from your local grid, and you have to think about those things. How we account for carbon in the electricity system is probably another 90-minute discussion, or probably a whole conference of discussions right there about how that works. From a pure carbon accounting standpoint, like just the rules about how you're supposed to do it, a lot of places you can use renewable grid power that you procure yourself. So you could get somebody else to build a plant on your behalf. You agree to buy that power. That's your renewable energy in that sense. So if you can credibly say the energy that you're getting is from renewable projects that you have enabled, then I think you can make the argument that the grid you're buying from the power you're buying from the grid is renewable. But I think this is an emerging area as well. I know Google is probably at the forefront of this. They've gone so far as to make sure all of their grid power from renewable sources is matched with supply that they directly control by the hour. And if you want to get to that level of detail, that's pretty sophisticated, and most campuses aren't quite there yet. But the idea, so if you believe that the grid power is renewable, once you get to that step, you're basically looking then at, you've got to lower the total input dramatically because it's going to cost you more money. That electricity is a much more expensive energy source than like burning gas, for example. But you don't need as much of it because you're getting what you're unlocking is that heat trading, which is where you're moving energy instead of making energy, and that's massively more efficient. I mean, so you can use a fraction of the energy as an input to get a lot of useful energy out of it because you're just moving it from one place to another. You're not. So that's really the key. So for most campuses, like in North Carolina, if you've got a lot of land and a fairly small campus, it's possible that you could maybe build enough solar yourself or wind yourself that you could make that claim. But even then, you're going to have to figure out ways to like tie into the grid and account for that. So there's still some ways to go. But as the overall grid gets cleaner, and by say 2050, arguably even pretty much everywhere in the United States, with maybe a few exceptions, you could expect that you will be to 100% renewable grid, or at least 98% renewable grid, something like that. I think that's practical to expect. So again, if you're thinking out longer term, it's not just about what's real today, but you got to think about where it's going to be in the future. So it's a gnarly question and one that I think about all day long. So hopefully I articulated my answer in the 2 minutes I just tried to answer. So.
Yeah, they're similar to us. They're a mountain community, makes it an additional challenge to find space for large renewable PV systems.
But doesn't mean, I guess that's the thing I want to get people away from. Putting the solar on your own campus, it's good. You should do that. You should as much as you can. But it's unrealistic to think that everybody is going to produce their own power. At a college campus, the energy intensity of the campus, you need more energy than you're going to be able to make on site. So kind of get over that. I don't know why people think that they have to make it all themselves. It's sort of like a frontier mentality or something like that. I don't make my own clothes. Why do I need to make my own electricity right at my own house? So I would challenge the premise of that kind of framing to some extent.
So this person asks, our campus steam system is full of leaks. Suggestion. So is this the prime ideal time to start moving towards cooler water, cooler molecules?
Yeah. So I think I mentioned, I didn't get into the detailed financials, and but I made the claim that making the switch is cost effective and has a payback. And the biggest way you make that payback, it's not really from the avoided energy cost, because as I said, you lower the amount of energy you put in by changing to electricity, but that electricity is more expensive. Your cost will go down a little bit, but the cost of the input's like 3, 4, or 5 times more expensive on a BTU basis. But you get rid of all sorts of maintenance issues. So in a lot of cases, the price to dig up your campus and replace all those steam pipes just to prolong this inefficient system for another 30, 40 years is really cost prohibitive. So if you're going to have to do that anyway, that's the time to make the switch. You don't have to switch the entire campus. Most campuses that have gone through this transition, they'll pick a section of their campus that's the worst, that they're going to, that's going to fail anyway, and they'll get it off the system. They'll lower the pressure on the rest of the system, especially if they're running into capacity constraints. So, perversely, the worse your system is, the better the business case is. If you've already made a bunch of efficiency improvements, it gets a little more challenging, if nothing else, just because you've got to go back to the well and convince the president and CFO that they have to care about energy again, which they don't tend to like to do.
Right. So the next question someone said, we've completed a study on energy conservation measures, and most of them have a low ratio of metric ton CO2 equivalent savings per dollar spent. It might be better for us to invest in the money into replacing fossil fuels with renewables. Can you comment on this? The pyramid you showed isn't quite a pyramid for us.
Yeah. So there's 2 thoughts here. So it depends on, if you're going to change out your central systems, it will completely change the economics of efficiency. In fact, in some of these Northeast schools, we're looking for cooling opportunities, as we're trying to add cooling load to balance out the system, which is really weird. Like, you're trying to, rather than getting rid of the need for energy in the building, you want to add the need for energy in the building so that you can capture that heat in the summer and inject it in the ground so you can grab it in the winter. And it's again, a kind of a complicated concept. if you can do things that are going to avoid the need for energy at all, and it's not going to, like if you're going to fix a steam trap, for example, but you're getting off steam, that's a good example of something that maybe you shouldn't make a bunch of investments in that if you're going to get rid of the system anyway. But there are a bunch of things that just remove, especially electricity demand, will probably benefit you both ways. So for example, in one of the Northeast schools, we're shifting their effort from fixing steam leaks to like envelope, like just making the buildings tighter so you're not losing so much energy out the side. Those are, you have to think about what type of energy you're using, when it's being used, and things like that as you get more into the systems thinking view. The other thing I would say is look at how you're making the cost benefit analysis for those projects, because sometimes people will underestimate the benefit of efficiency because they're not taking into consideration all that loss in the system. Like if you're in that first state where you've got that 50% loss and you avoid the energy at the building, you're actually doubling the impact on the campus in theory, you know, but it also depends on when it happens. So it's super complicated, but I don't think you can only do one or the other. You have to be looking at both simultaneously. But what that mix is going to change as your system changes. So there really isn't a specific answer. And the answer today will not be the answer in the future.
All right. There's a lot of questions, so we're going to keep on.
Probably prompting more than I'm answering, I suppose, which is part of the point.
Yeah. Can you share your thoughts on the potential for projects that involve multiple campuses within the same university system?
Yeah, well, I think there you get into, certainly if you want to look at grid renewables, that's a great place to start. You know, we've worked a lot with the University of California system. They've actually set up an entire office that just does that, right? They buy, they basically set up their own utility. And I know you guys at App State have your own utility connection as well, right? I mean, like you're like an equity partner in the local utility or something like that. So that's one way to think about it, is like through more energy procurement at scale, because you can build one very large project at a much lower cost than putting solar on a bunch of roofs. So that's one thing. They're also looking at, like we talked a little bit about the biogas. The only reason they're able to do that is because they were doing it at such a scale that they could take advantage of some of the California regulatory incentives that are available to them. And they were aggregating projects, and they have like one team that focuses on that, and they don't have to go through the process of figuring that out at every individual campus. And so they have one central office that figures it out. So if you're in a system, that's really huge, is getting aggregation of procurement. The other one would be contracting. So I know as a consultant, I spend an inordinate amount of time responding to RFPs and going through that process. And I'm just doing consulting work. I'm not doing infrastructure work, which is at a whole nother scale. So if there's ways that you can like get the contracting mechanisms kind of smoothed out, that's a huge opportunity at a system level. So that each campus doesn't have to go through this journey by themselves, because otherwise it's going to take too long. If we all have to figure it out, we all have another 10-year journey to go through. But if one person can figure this out and share it through that system to the other person, we have a chance at actually moving everybody at the same time. So I don't know, that's a couple of different ways.
Yeah. So literally a year ago, you and I were sat at a conference talking about these issues. And it was, the last conference I think we both attended in person, and, in Atlanta. And I remember we had this conversation about who's going to be the first large university to, to get to neutrality. And I remember recently saw Hawaii had made an announcement in the press. But, so this question is, looking at your most successful campuses that you've worked with, how close are some of them to getting to neutrality, climate neutrality?
Yeah, there are a few private liberal arts colleges that are getting really close, and there are a lot that are making the neutrality claim using offsets or some combination of offsets. I'm not talking about that, but I know Carleton College is one. My colleague Rob McKenna worked on a climate action plan for them over 10 years ago, and they're most of the way through it. Like they actually did it, and they got they actually built wind turbines in partnership with another local campus. They made the steam to hot water transition. I've toured it. It's really cool. I have a podcast episode about that with Martha Larson that I would recommend folks listen to. They're much smaller than most of the campuses at the public, like some of the big public schools, but they've de-risked a lot of the ideas, and a lot of the things I shared today were at least partially inspired by some of the work that she had done and some of the engineers that she worked with. So I'd say that I know there are some campuses like Weber State in Utah they've done some really aggressive things on the energy efficiency front and on this thermal. I think they're using more of an ambient based system, so trading heat, different kind of climate zone. And then I think there are, like the Hawaii campuses, they're doing some great things. They kind of are forced to because of their energy situation out there with, electricity is crazy expensive, like 50 cents a kilowatt hour at times. And so they have kind of a different paradigm. So I think they're going to be the leaders by definition. But I know Arizona State has done a bunch. They still have, more room to go, but they're deploying massive amounts of on-site and off-site solar. I don't think they have steam, if I remember correctly. But there's some really good examples of leading campuses. And then I've been doing a lot of work with the UC campuses, although we're still struggling through some of these big cogen issues, as I mentioned. So that's there, but there's rays or shoots of light out there that are shoots of I'm not sure what the analogy is. So let's move on to the next question.
Optimism.
Optimism. There you go. Thank you.
You've mentioned de-risking a couple of times, and there's a few questions, about that concept. And could you walk us through just a little more of kind of what that means as we try to as all of us try to kind of navigate our solutions related to mitigation?
Sure. Yeah. That little, the cartoony graphic thing I showed was an example of that. It's like, how can you get the ideas in front of people that have short attention span, aren't really motivated to try, they don't care about energy, they don't care about, maybe they're not, they care about climate change in the broad sense, but they don't really see themselves as having that being as part of their job. So part of de-risking is just like, how can you succinctly communicate an idea in a way that people can understand and that they can see a role for themselves to play in? So I think at the broadest sense, that's what you're talking about. But when you're talking about an institution, institutions are set up to live very long periods of time and change very slowly by definition. That's why, we call them institutions for a reason. If you want to change that institution, there are tons of barriers in your way to keep you from doing that. Otherwise, the campus would get taken off in some wild, crazy idea, sort of like my software story, all the time, and that would be very bad. Your campus would eventually crash and burn. So de-risking an idea really is coming up with a concept that you can communicate, putting it out there to people before they feel direct risk that it's a real thing, so they can give you an honest kind of impact or reaction to it, and then taking that input and then kind of reshaping it and then putting it back in front of them again and again and again. And at some point, it starts taking on a life of its own. It starts becoming their idea, not your idea. And so it's more art than science, but it's really about knowing who are the decision makers, who are the influencers, and really mapping out a strategy for how you work through each one of those steps. So a lot of these ideas come from the Leith Sharp, that I know, Lee, that's how you and I met originally, but it's more of a lifelong journey about how do you change an organization. So I have kind of a fun position where I get to see lots of different organizations and how they function differently. I kind of described how Michigan State worked when we worked with them at that time. It's a totally different leadership structure there now, so it's not the same, but the same concepts apply. So it's, can you get those champions? Can you get those committees? Do you know who's where? Do you have an ability to communicate? Are you leveraging students to be your ally rather than fighting against them? Are you leveraging faculty to bring them in rather than making them feel shut out? Are you helping the facility staff not feel at risk for you're going to privatize them or kill their budget or things like that? So you really have to understand what is your idea, what impact is it going to have to individual people, tailor your message to what that group is going to hear, and take their input and change your message as you need to, because it's a concept until it's actually done.
So it's like really focusing on building relationships, building trust, and using your best Jedi mind tricks.
Basically, but not even in a way that you're trying to be disingenuous. I mean,
Right,
it's just
exactly.
like, yeah, because if you do that, you're probably exactly. But it's that's a good way to summarize it.
Yeah. So we have time for 2 more questions. So are there electrification options for central heating plants? I'm thinking of the long lifetime investment in gas-fired boilers, or if we go for geothermal heat exchange, are we just going to retire many boilers early?
Yeah. So if depending on the size of your campus and the configuration, all that aside, but you're probably going to, well, let me say it this way. If you start moving to a geothermal system, it's going to still need some other backup sources for certain times of the year. Depends on your climate zone, especially in the Northeast or in the Midwest, where you get really, really cold winters. I know you guys get some pretty decent weather out there in Boone. You're not going to completely get rid of the need for that combustion in the short term, probably. I mean, there are some ways to do it, but it gets more expensive as you go further down the road. But you're going to end up phasing it in. So I think what we typically will see is it allows you to retire the oldest assets first. It depends on typically you don't just have a complete set of boilers at one vintage. There's usually a really old one and a different one. And sometimes the oldest one is the most reliable because you know how to work with it and things like that. So I think it's more about just staging your retirements as you're bringing in that other system. So it's going to be phased. It's going to take time. You can probably get things out of your building so you can get some space back, or you get, you don't necessarily need things. As you connect a building, you can get rid of some of the mechanical equipment in that building. So it's a complicated transition process. It's not like you just turn it on one day and then all this stuff gets shut off, because that's never going to fly financially and technically. So I don't know if that helps, but.
Yeah, thanks. Okay, so we're rounding up. We're at the end with the one final question. It says, I think the task of transitioning to a less carbon dependent energy system can be daunting, especially to students who don't fully understand the process and the administration involved. What would you tell a passionate group of students who are demanding rapid change from their university?
Well, keep demanding rapid change from your university, because that is your primary role as a student, and it was the role that I tried to play when I was a student, and it was the role that probably the person the president of your university likely was in that position when they were a student. But I would also say, learn as much as you possibly can and be compassionate about the people that you're lobbying. So if you do get an opportunity to speak to that president, lead with gratitude for the opportunity to speak with them, because they are dealing with some really gnarly issues. I mean, of course, depends on who it is, and if they're just, if they're not worthy of that type of gratitude, then obviously you can maybe change your tactics. But too often I see a really willing president that really wants to make change, and they're navigating the complexity of running a large organization, and they're getting inundated by students just kind of yelling at them yelling platitudes at them without really understanding what the president's dealing with. So I would lead with questions. I would lead with understanding. I would lead with we're going to keep demanding change. Well, that's not going away. We're not letting go of that. But you gotta learn too. So it's super complicated, is to keep in mind. So don't think there is that silver bullet solution to it. But that doesn't mean your messaging probably needs to be more silver bullet-y, because 90% fossil free with some backup fuel with renewables, that doesn't make for a good tagline or whatever. That's fine. I understand that. But you got to understand that it probably isn't 100% of this or 100% of that. It's probably a mix of all these things, and it's going to shift through time, and it's going to change through time. And so kind of know that going into it. But be a student, be loud, get your voice heard. Don't stop doing that.
Awesome. Well, Dave, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure, as always, having you here. I'm sure that people will probably reach out to you with additional questions. Thanks for for sharing the resources and just your time with us. It means a lot. This is important work, and what you're doing. We need your perspective. This is the time that we all need to rally together and work together to solve these very complex, wicked problems.
Absolutely. Thank you very much for the opportunity. It was a joy. As I said, I'm nervous going into these things, but knowing I was going to get to talk to you, it was just fun. So thanks for the opportunity. All right.
All right. So that was our plenary session for the summit. I encourage everyone to reach out to us if you have any questions. If you want to try to connect to someone within the Energy Summit family, and we're happy to get you together. If you have any ideas for us for future plenary sessions or webinars, we're going to be we're planning for all with COVID. We're planning for every scenario. So the summit this summer. Again, we're still trying to figure out whether or not we're going to be able to meet face to face. But if not, we're going to provide some opportunity for us to share best practice and stories with each other. So stay tuned on that. Don't forget to pay attention and calendar if you can, and register for the upcoming webinars. And if you have register for the afternoon sessions, we look forward to seeing you there. Again, thanks to the students and the faculty and staff and all of our friends and partners that have worked really hard to put this together. A special shout out to Deef Alexander, who's kind of the man behind the curtain a lot of you hear from. We wouldn't be able to do it without him. And with all that said, have a wonderful rest of your day and keep fighting the good fight. And we really appreciate you.